Welcome, everyone, to the Charters Education Network Forum. I'm Charlie Barker. I'll be the moderator for today's session. Excited about it. We've got a group from the Montessori Group to talk about the Montessori methodology and compassion without boundaries. We have three guests with us, privileged to have three guests from Montessori to tell us all about that. And we have Dr. Catherine McTamaney, Dr. Amira Magaji, and Preeti Patel. Catherine is Associate Professor, Department of Teaching and Learning at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College here in the USA. Dr. Amira Magaji is President of the American Montessori Society Board of Directors. And Preeti Patel is Head of Education at Montessori Central International. So welcome to our forum, guest speakers. And before I turn things over to you to talk about the Montessori methodology, I'd like for us to just maybe take 2 to 3 minutes of a grounding exercise, which we have traditionally done at our forums in the past. So I would just invite each of you to take a position, an upright and relaxed position. You may want to stop your video. You might want to close your eyes. And I would just invite you to take a few deep breaths, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. And now I'd invite you to find that area of your body that feels grounded. Perhaps it's your feet on the floor, or as you sit in the chair, the comfort and grounding of the chair, perhaps with your arms folded or hands together, taking in a breath, breathing in and breathing out. And for the next 2 to 3 minutes, I would just invite you to go into silent. Let's go into silent meditation. And if your mind is distracted, simply come back to your breath, breathing in and breathing out. And now I'd invite you to simply focus on your breath, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. And when you're ready, you may open your eyes and let's return to the group. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Catherine. Welcome, Catherine.
Good morning, welcome. I'm so happy to be here and what a lovely way to just start my day. I think the hour before I logged onto the call was pretty chaotic and just nice to have a moment to regroup and connect to a different intent for the next few minutes together. I'm Catherine McTammany. I'm an associate professor here at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. I've been here at Vanderbilt for all in all 30 years, a little bit longer than that. I was a student at Vanderbilt before I joined the faculty about 17 years ago. So I'm here surrounded by one of the most beautiful physical spaces I think of any university in the world. And I'm really happy to have so many beautiful faces on the screen as well. I want to start just by introducing generally some of the practices or principles of Montessori to make sure that we have some shared conversation or shared understanding of what Dr. Magaji and Preeti and I will be talking about today. For those of you who are not Montessorians, if this is new to you, Montessori is a practice of education in some settings. For those of us who are maybe more deeply entrenched in Montessori, we might say that it's more than a curriculum, but a way of engaging in the world. It is a life perspective on how people learn and what kinds of communities we might be committed to if we think about particularly the nature of childhood differently than we may be encouraged to do so outside of these spaces. So Montessorians draw most of our practice from the work of Dr. Maria Montessori and the original schools about 100 years ago when they were first founded in Italy. But over that time, just like children have changed and the movement has grown, the practices of Montessori have also become more complicated and more complex and serve children in very different spaces now than the one little classroom in Rome at the turn of the last century. Montessori is present on 110 different countries right now and serves across the face of the planet about 20,000 children. About 500 of those schools are here in the United States. As a core principle for our classrooms, Montessorians believe some key things about children that regardless of where we are in the world or what our particular training backgrounds have been, we hold in common. We believe that children are intrinsically good. And when I talk to my teacher education students, I always say that that's not necessarily something that we take for granted in talking in spaces of early childhood or educational settings, but Montessorians believe that children are intrinsically good. We believe that children are intrinsically committed to being a part of their own communities and that they want to contribute in peaceful ways to communities in which their contributions have meaning. So we look at spaces where children exist as being places where there's lots of opportunity for purposeful engagement with their community. And we believe that when things are awry in the lives of children, when their behavior suggests some disruption, or they're not demonstrating, they're not engaging in the community in peaceful ways, that the responsibility for that lies to the adult, because we believe that it's the nature of children to be peaceful and joyful. When they're not, we look to ourselves as adults to change the environment and to look for the kinds of obstacles to that development that we may have inadvertently imposed on the child. Those are the things that are in common, but there are lots of different ways that people come to Montessori, how they're trained to become Montessori teachers, what their own relationships with the practice are. Myself, I was a Montessori kid raised by Montessori parents. I had Montessori teacher education colleagues that like sat around our dining room table when I was a young child, and it's as much a lived part of my experience as any of the other cultural norms of my family. But so I don't have any choice but to share Montessori in my deep blood. But there are lots of other ways that people come to this particular work, and representing two of those paths today are Dr. Amira Magaji from the American Montessori Society and Preeti Patel from Montessori Centers International and the Montessori Group. So I want to put myself on mute for a second and allow each of you to introduce yourself. Dr. Magaji, could you go first?
Sure, I can go first. My name is Dr. Amira Mogaji. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I live and thrive on the stolen lands of the Potawatomi tribe. I'm here in Southwest Michigan in the land we now call Kalamazoo. I am the current AMS board president. I'm also a founding board member of Montessori for Social Justice. I was the CEO, head of school of Philadelphia Montessori Charter School, which is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a very under-resourced neighborhood. I was the principal for an AMS accredited public and within a district, a Montessori school here in Southwest Michigan in Kalamazoo. I served as the chief academic officer for City Garden Montessori School, which is an anti-bias, anti-racist focused Montessori school, which is now a network in St. Louis, Missouri. I am now back in Kalamazoo specifically because I'm from Philadelphia, specifically so our children can attend Northglade Montessori, where I served as the principal, because we thought a public Montessori education was optimal for our children, particularly in that space. I currently serve as a district transformation coach in an urban school district here in Michigan, which basically means I coach principals in educational equity and in systems thinking. And I serve on the ERASE board of directors here, which is erasing racism and celebrating equality and equity here in Kalamazoo. And so I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Preeti?
Oh, what an act to follow. My name is Preeti Patel. I'm head of education at Montessori Center International, which is part of the Montessori Group. Absolutely thrilled that we could invite Dr. Amira Magaji to participate in this conversation, and thrilled to have Catherine McTammany, as always, on all our conversations. Catherine Wells, she's sort of based at the Vanderbilt University, is also a consultant for the Montessori Group, so it's always wonderful to have that conversation with her. Now, my background in Montessori education, I only recently found out I was a Montessori child. It was something that was a little bit hidden from me. My mum trained as a Montessori teacher, and I had no idea. I didn't get the opportunity to go to a Montessori school, but my home life was very Montessori. And, we never talked about it being Montessori. It was just how things were. And as I sort of grew and, went on to have my own family and started to think about what I wanted for my own children, the conversation started, and I was drawn to Montessori education as I started to look at different settings for my son. And as I walked around a number of settings, there was something that just kept drawing me to it. And I decided to retrain and become a Montessori educator. I ran and managed a Montessori setting for 15 years. And then there came a juncture in my life where I decided I needed to do something different. And adult education and training the next generation of Montessori teachers seemed to be the most logical step for me. And hence I joined the team at Montessori Center International. I'm now the head of education here and look to, at developing courses and training for the next generation of teachers. That's me in a very quick nutshell. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. I mean, and I think that that was the primary goal in inviting both of you to share in the conversation today, is to think about the work that we do as adults and the kinds of experiences that that we provide for adult teacher education practitioners as they sort of change their way of being in spaces with young children. Montessori cautions us, encourages us. I'm not sure what the right verb to use is, but there are three roles, primary roles to the work of a teacher in a Montessori classroom. The way that we conceptualize this work is the Montessori teacher is scientist, servant, and saint. And the first part of that, the idea of teachers as being scientists, relates back to those observations about Montessori, about what we understand about the nature of children, that we believe that children are developing according to their own internal nature, and that our responsibility in preparing environments that serve them is to observe them very carefully so that we understand exactly what this child's development is doing. There's sort of mystical language inside of Montessori that we use around the secret of childhood, that children have their own internal drives and purposes, and that if we're going to be able to support those best, we have to pay very close attention. So the scientist part of the Montessori teacher's life is in that observation and really understanding our classrooms as being empirical spaces where each day is an experiment of measuring out whether or not we're carefully serving the development of the children in front of us. The role of Montessori teacher as servant is in the preparation. So what do we do with the things that we've seen in our observations of children, and how do we create environments that support and uplift that development? That we're building an environment that ultimately turn over to the children. The ultimate goal of the Montessori teacher is to be able to leave the classroom and have the children not notice we left. So really creating spaces where the children take ownership and agency in their own creations of these communities of children. And then the one that I wanted to sort of dig into today is that third one, the idea of Montessori teachers as saints, that it's part of our work in the classroom to model compassionate care, to be attentive to the children's needs in ways that are respectful but not overbearing, to be deeply appreciative of the unknowable nature of the people we share the classroom with, and to allow space for that to happen, that we're modeling that in our own engagements as adults, which lots of Montessori teachers struggle with. We have a hard time transitioning to becoming Montessori teachers because so much of how we think about the role of teacher is sort of sage on the stage at the front of the room. We're supposed to be the people who have answers to things, and we're supposed to be the people who already know how to do it right. And we're teaching children how to be right like we are in other settings. But in Montessori, that's the opposite. We're meant to be sort of intentionally wilting flowers, getting out of the way. So I wonder, from both a teacher education's perspective, Preeti, or an organizing Montessori schools, you're working with so many teachers and principals and school leaders, Amira, like, what are the challenges to being able to help teachers move into that space of humility and compassion that's so much a part of the Montessori practice?
Do you want to go first, Preeta? Okay, so I just feel compelled to say this first, and that is all of what you said is who we are, right, as Montessorians. And when I think about who are the children in front of the teacher, right? You're talking about the Montessori teacher as the saint, and you're talking about observation. You're talking about what do we need to do as the adult in the room in order to serve these children appropriately, right? I think I have to say that part of what needs to happen in all spaces, but we're talking about Montessori right now, is that we have to know what lens we're actually looking through. Like, are we seeing children for who they actually are? So when we think about, you just mentioned sage and the stage, and that there's a right? There's also a right person that some teachers perceive. Who is the right children in front of me? Who are the children in front of me? Do you actually even know who they are? And so I just want to offer that our primary role as that saint, as that scientist, and that servant is to create equitable and inclusive environments. And in order to do that, we have to actually know who our children are. And in order to do that is to know what lens we're looking through. In order to look through the correct lens, we have to be reflective of ourselves. So Maria Montessori says in The Secret of Childhood, a teacher must prepare himself entirely by systematically studying himself so that he can tear out the most deep-rooted defects, those in fact which impede his relations with children. So like we have to be reflective, but we actually have to know where we're deficient. And so I just really want to offer that because we're talking about compassion, right? There are children who are not even accessing the Montessori education because there's no relationship. There's no access to the actual teacher because they don't feel like they belong in that environment. So I think the primary thing is to reflect upon who we are as people, reflect upon, do we actually know our children for who they are without the barriers of perception of who we think we are, what their defects may be, their deficiencies may be, and that from there, remove those barriers so we actually can create these environments where all children can thrive. I think it actually starts from, do I create an environment where every child believes within the deepest recesses of their soul that this is my space and it was created for me?
Well, in terms of teacher education, I think for me, it is really flipping the understanding of what the role of the educator is, firstly. I think, every one of us comes in with an understanding of what we think the role of the educator is. And a lot of that is, our own sort of experiences that we've had of, who our teachers were and what they meant for us and what they did. And Montessori education is very different to many of the experiences that all of us on the screen will have had in terms of our educational journeys. And what Dr. Mira just said around, reflection, that is the fundamental aspect of developing practice, I think. Without sort of reflecting upon who we are and how we need to grow and change, you cannot become a Montessori educator. There's a lot of self-reflection within that. The idea of this saint, I love the word, when Catherine brought up the word saint, because you have this image of what a saintly person is. And are all Montessori teachers saints? I don't know. That's something we have, that's another debate to be had. But I think it's really sort of that reflection upon ourselves, isn't it, of what we want to model, what behaviors we want children to take forward, what we don't want them to sort of proceed with. But looking through the lens of observation, are we seeing children for who they are, or are we seeing the children for what we want them to be? And there's a real sort of distinct difference there, because if you're seeing children for who they are, you can sort of support their needs and their development in a particular way. But if you perceive them as who you want them to be, then you direct their learning in a way that might not necessarily support them. So that sort of throws us those challenges. And I think that perhaps for new sort of teacher trainees and new trainee educators, that is the biggest barrier, I think, sometimes. What do we see the role of the teacher, and are we willing to let go of some of the things that we bring to the picture, as it were?
I think about how difficult that transition is for so many of us who, like when I tried to describe that for Montessorians, Montessori is not just a curriculum, that it's actually a lived experience. And we think about Montessori as something that infuses the way that we interact with each other as adults, the way that we interact with the children. But that's often in conflict with the idea that there is this like professional space that we're supposed to live in. And I think one of the things that makes it very hard to do this practice in a way that's sustaining is when those conflicts arise, right? That there's the I work in a community where we are all identified by the letters behind our names. But in the classroom, I should be the least important person in that space. And the rules of the classroom are so different than they are in all of the other adult spaces that I live within. Dr. Mugaji, I wonder, especially thinking about these very, very diverse communities of teachers that you're working with, like how do you actually support teachers in the sort of soul cracking work of humility that being in service with children in this particular way actually asks of us?
Thanks for that question. I think fundamentally, I think people don't know what they don't know. Like for instance, like part of the work that I do is, and I'm in the US. So part of the work that I do is around providing like the fundamental background knowledge around systemic oppression. Like some people don't know why things are the way they are. And so you're making different decisions. So it's not just Johnny is having difficulty, right, in class, or that potentially as a adult learner, you may have difficult children or challenging children, that there is this whole line of things that have happened, which have created this system, which has created this life that these children are living. And it could be not just racial, but there's all sorts of reasons why children are identified as others. And just understanding everybody's experiences are different, and that's what the diversity is. The diversity is that we're all different and we all bring something else to the table. And so if we're always constantly, so even outside of Montessori, but we're talking about Montessori today, as a school leader, and I also did launch an ABAR teacher training program in St. Louis, which was specifically around always asking these questions, like who's benefiting from the decisions that we're making, even in the classroom. Are we asking the right questions? Are we making sure that all children are getting what they need in this space? Are we making sure the adults are getting what they need in this space so that they can create these, help support the experiences of children? And so I think that knowledge is critical, because this is actually not a vacuum. All of a sudden people decided we have to be nicer to each other, right? There was actually systems in place that created the inequities to begin with. And so I think it starts with creating a space for knowledge, creating a space for conversation. I believe that in all organizations, we should operate in communities of practice, so that as we are having new learnings, we're having these reflective discussions about it, because we're all at a different place in the journey, right? We're having these conversations about it and we're helping each other think of next steps. And so I think that happens the same in the Montessori space, either whether it's teacher education, because everybody's coming with their own experiences and their own outlook, and also when these adult learners ultimately get into classrooms with students. I think that it's just always creating a reflective space, a safe reflective space for the communities of adults that you're supporting, who are supporting children. And I want to say that safe doesn't mean that it feels good. Safe just means that you can say what you need to say and I can say what I need to say, but it doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable all the time.
What are your thoughts on that, Preeti?
I completely agree with Dr. Mira in terms of creating those safe spaces for reflection. And I think they have to be uncomfortable but safe spaces, because if you're always comfortable, then I think a lot of conversation isn't truly helpful or beneficial for growth and development. So I think, that there doesn't have to be conflict, but there has to be challenge and constructive challenge in terms of the conversations that we are having. Because it's hard to be humble. It's very difficult. That's not how society has raised us. And having that humility that we need to have with children takes a lot of work, takes a lot of practice to get to that stage. But, we have to believe that the children are good, as you said, Catherine. We have to truly believe that. We have to truly believe that the decisions that we are taking as the adults in the environment are truly supportive of those children. And often, when discussions or decisions are made within an environment, I don't know how many adults actually stop to think about, who is this decision benefiting? And is it for the child that we're doing this, or are we doing this for our benefit as the adults in the environment? And that's quite difficult because, often there are always 100 things that we will have to do. Sometimes we forget the child in the process. And it's really important that we are continually reflecting upon this and coming back to the core reason as to why we're there. And we're there to serve the child. And I don't mean that in a subservient way, because that can be misunderstood when we use terminology like serving the child. But really to think about how are we benefiting the experiences that the children are having. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of practice and a lot of support, I think.
Can I add to what Ms. Patel just said? I just think this is something that I like to offer when I do professional development. And that is, I do believe that just like we have these beliefs about children, they're inherently good. I do believe people who go into education, particularly Montessori education, they love children. They believe in why they're there. They want to do the best for children. They want to be humble. They want to move out the way of children. And we have internal stuff, right? We have implicit stuff that we don't realize. And I think sometimes we just have to give them facts, right? And so one study that I like to share because it blows people's minds is that there was a Yale study, the Yale Child Study Center did a study about in 2016, right? Around bias and perception around students. And it was with early childhood children. And so in this study, there were about 135 teachers who participated. And so what they said to these teachers, they said, listen, every time you see a child misbehave or have some kind of disruptive behavior, you're going to push this button. So what the teachers didn't know is that when they were pushing this button, they were also looking at the eyes of the teachers. It was some kind of scan, and so that they can see who they were looking at. So they were black boys, black girls, white boys, and white girls. And almost every time only the black boys were getting the button. And it turns out that there was no negative behavior present, actually. It was just the expectation of the negative behavior. And so when we're having these conversations about reflection, it's like when we edit our own papers, right? We wrote it, we think it's wonderful. We're going to miss the mistakes that we've made. That's why we have a copy editor, right? And so that when you're thinking about, we all do that. We all have these things that we're already looking at that little boy over there because we think he's going to do something wrong. And I think when you have like studies like that, it's helpful to just for people to recognize like, yeah, I love children and I also do have these biases that I don't recognize. That's the whole point. It's implicit. We don't know it's there. So I just wanted to offer that as well. And it usually blows people's minds when I say that and they can actually tell me, oh boy, I do this, 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 and this. And I didn't even realize I was doing it.
I mean, there is always a lot of unconscious bias that we all carry, and we have to be accepting of the fact that we all have unconscious biases. And that we also bring a lot of baggage with us, you know, in terms of our own experiences, both positive and negative, but, you know, we have to recognize that. And you know, when we're thinking about the term, the spiritual preparation of the teacher, it's really about looking at those unconscious biases, looking at that baggage, and really being truly truthful with ourselves, which can be really uncomfortable in terms of sort of supporting our own individual development. Because if we don't tackle those things with honesty, then we can't really work with the children in the way that we aim to.
Charlie, do you want us to stop and take some questions? I see that there's one hand raised. I'm happy to just integrate this. Mr. Jameson.
So Catherine, Amira, and Priti, thank you so much for your presentation. Our kids went to Waldorf when they were young. We didn't have a Montessori option, which I sort of look at both models as being incredible because they acknowledge the spiritual dimension of the child. And I've been spending a lot of time over the last few years looking at trauma, and I'm looking at you, Amira. And what I've learned is that we have personal, collective, and intergenerational trauma. And I'm curious how Montessori teachers are informed about trauma in the classroom and with respect to the kids that are walking through that door.
So you said my name, right? So
yes, ma'am. Well, you're in Philly, right?
I'm in Kalamazoo, but it's
Kalamazoo. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I'm from Philly, and I think we both can offer something here. I think that we all are learning new things about trauma for sure. Thank you for mentioning those three. I think as we move forward and think about not only the students in the classroom in terms of Montessori settings, but the preparation of the adults who are going to be supporting them, it is critical that they have an understanding about trauma, social emotional learning. When the world was regular, right? And now we have COVID on top of that, and what has happened over the last 2 years, and how what I think is, for me, I'm only speaking for myself, but what is important to me around trauma, and when you're training teachers and talking to teachers who are already in practice, is that the academics are important, right? And the social emotional learning and the trauma-based informed practice is important, but it doesn't trump everything. It's like, you can't just say, we're only going to hug today and nobody's going to learn. And so part of that is this learning how to infuse it appropriately, understanding who are the children who are in your classroom. That's all about engagement with families when you talk about that generational trauma as well, and why things are impacting their lives the way they are, and building relationships. And obviously being compassionate about, this is, we take children as they are, just like we should take adults. Who are the children who are in our space, and how do we support them? And knowing that trauma is overarching in all of it, and that everybody should have some kind of trauma informed training. That's my personal belief. But it's not instead of also academics. We don't want to create a bigger problem.
I would add to that to say that I think that there's sort of the industry of teacher preparation. The industry of teacher education is very different from what Montessori originally called us to do, which is to say that if you want to go and do a Google search for trauma-informed care, or you want to do a Google search for compassionate teaching practices, things like that, you'll come up with these lists, and with training programs and curricula that you can say, I'm doing these things, and if I do these things, then I'm engaging in a trauma-informed way. Or if I understand what are the qualities on the list of adverse childhood experiences, then I know the words, I know the language, I know the lingo, right? That's really different from the kind of deep thinking that each of us needs to be doing every day if we're actually in service with children. Which is to say that, just like if I was trying to change my diet, I might want to understand a little bit about the chemistry, and there might be rules that I follow while I'm habitualizing practices, but it doesn't eventually remove the wonder that I should experience when I'm tasting new foods, or when I'm imagining the extraordinary things that have to happen for a seed to become a tomato. Right. And I am concerned sometimes as a teacher educator that because the practice of teaching is so hard, that we ask teachers to rely on these crutches of predetermined curricula for how to respond to children's needs. And that we let them stay with the crutches too long, when we should be pushing past them to say, this is a starting place for the conversation around adverse childhood experiences, or this is a starting place for understanding how both a child's trauma, social trauma, my trauma as a teacher is going to change what I do. But it doesn't give me, it's not enough. The work is too complicated for us to just do that sort of starting language. It's like the difference between Duolingo and being really fluent in a community, that there may be some things that I do to understand the space, but my curiosity and my wonder for what more I might learn always has to stay quite as high, just as high. Hop in. I don't have to call on you, Dr. Mogaji.
Well, I just wanted to add to that. I agree with that. And so I just want to clarify, I'm not talking about programs. I don't actually believe in separate programs. So anything that we do in service of children in a Montessori setting, I think the conversation is always, what does it look like in this space? Mm-hmm. Particularly when you're talking about public and all different, what if we believe in Montessori philosophy? What is what we need to do? What does it look like here? So I just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting we go get, a SEL program. I mean, there should be an understanding that there are things that we all come with, experiences that children have. And in order to support those children and to be in service with those children, what does it need to look like according to our philosophy? What does it look like in this space? I just wanted to be clear about that part. I'm not sending people to buy an SEL box right now.
I think Ole has a question. Ole?
Can I just add to that? I was just sort of, before we have that question, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to add, having programs sometimes can become a tick box exercise rather than a real support and solution. So I think we really have to start with, what does it look like for us here and now? What is it that we need to focus on in terms of the children that we have? Because trauma, it's such a big term, isn't it? And there can be all sorts of different traumas that we're dealing with. And I don't think there can ever be a program or a training that will encompass everything. So it's really starting with our children and really seeing what it is that they need. And making sure that we don't just do it for the sake of doing it and say, yeah, we've ticked that box, it's done. That's the important part to sort of consider that. Apologies, please. Next question.
Well, it's following on the same thoughts that Gard brought up. I actually started a Montessori kindergarten some 33 years ago when my children needed some pedagogical support outside of the home, and I have learned a lot about myself in the last 33 years, and reflecting back, I think that some of the teachers that we had in our Montessori school could have benefited from overcoming some of their own traumas or childhood wounds. And I'm wondering, in the education or afterwards, is there any kind of personal, kind of one-on-one support for the emerging Montessori teachers? And is there something to support them also when they are practicing in their jobs thereafter?
I think about when I'm talking to novice teachers in particular and trying to understand what's brought them to this very complicated work, that I agree with Dr. Mogaji. I think most of the time people come into teaching because they have, it's a helping field and they're trying to make things better. Sometimes people come to teaching because it's a captive audience. And if you are reaffirming or re-edifying who's, sort of the way that it feels for us when you are the center of attraction, of attention, or the way that it feels when you have teachers who say well, I love being with children because they make me feel so good. That's not a perspective that works really well in Montessori, because our goal as Montessori teachers is to become less important. And I think part of the work of teacher education in Montessori is preparing people for that. I'm looking at my other screen, Montessori, to pull some of Montessori's language itself. She said, when she feels herself aflame with interest, seeing the spiritual phenomena of the child, and experiences a serene joy and an insatiable eagerness in observing them, then she will begin to have become a teacher. And I think the important language in that for me is that that's the beginning of the process of becoming a teacher, is when just the curiosity of feeling that joy in observing children without judgment. That's the beginning of it. But for a lot of teachers, it's not until they're really master teachers and they've been there for generations that they realize, oh, that's actually more important than whether or not they're reading by the time they're 4 years old, or they're doing 4-digit multiplication in their 3rd year in the Montessori classroom. There are a lot of folks that come to Montessori and districts that come to Montessori because the academic outcomes are so strong that it gets in the way of what the work was supposed to be about. And I think 100 years later, we're really struggling with that still as a movement, to say Montessori promised us this different landscape if we did this well. And why is it that the peaceful world that we thought was going to come to fruition isn't here yet? If we've got so much more Montessori than we did 100 years ago. And I think it comes down to those day-to-day conflicts between whether we're doing this in a compassionate way without judgment and without agenda, or if we're trying to fit Montessori into sort of outside regulation spaces that don't actually value what we say we value as teachers. That kind of cognitive dissonance is something that Montessori teachers struggle with over their entire careers. For some of us, it brings us out of the classroom entirely. And then I'll let Dr. Magaji and Preeta Patel talk about what they do to try to keep support for the teachers who are actually in the spaces doing that work every day.
I think what's critical, thank you for even for saying that, you know, because it's this, the theory and the kind of pie in the sky and the beauty of it when you're in teacher training, and then you show up, right? And then there's 25, 28 students, and then it's all these things you have to do on this checklist, and how do you reconcile the beauty you were expecting with the checklist that you have to make sure you do, right? And that's regardless of whether it's an independent, private, or public school. And I think that one of the that's really important, if you really are doing Montessori the way it is intended, so that it's implemented fully, so that children really get to have that experience. I do think the leader needs to be Montessori trained, because that is the person who is in the classrooms, who's having conversations with the teachers, who can elevate them and celebrate with them when things are going, when they're seeing what they learned in training and able to practice it, and also to support them when there's challenges, when they can't figure out, how do I do this that's a requirement when I know we say we are Montessori, and being able to either share personal experiences or helping them to troubleshoot. And yes, I do think there should be mentors. There's always should be consistent mentorship, but also that leader who sets the vision, so that nobody thinks they're operating against what's supposed, because everybody wants to do the right thing, right? And so I think for me, that's critical, that the leader of the institution helps to continue the learning from the teacher training program, and also to support the teachers while they're there.
I agree with both of you. I think it's that beginning that Catherine just mentioned, you know, I think it's important that every educator recognizes that this is a never-ending journey, that we should be continually learning, we should continually be developing. And I think the mentorship then comes through that. I think, you know, for a very long time, you know, it has been that, you know, practitioners have done their training and think, that's it, that's the end of it, I know it all, I can go and do it. But really, you know, if we are to serve the child of today and the child of tomorrow, then we have to be continually developing ourselves and really reflecting upon that development and that change, and continuing to grow ourselves. I think that's the important bit. And then the mentorship that, you know, will come through that, and that recognition for support will come through that. You know, Dr. Magaji quoted a study earlier. If we disregard studies like that and others that are out there, then we're not doing what we need to do for the children. You know, we have to recognize that the children 100 years ago were very different to the children we have today and the children who will come tomorrow. So we have to continue to reflect ourselves and continue to grow and train.
And to provide support for each other as Montessorians that is also Montessori consistent, right? Like most of us in Montessori classrooms were not Montessori children. And so the very practice that we're doing is foreign to us. It's not our mother tongue. And so we are when it's a stressful day, when we are having a hard time, we resort back to the things that are natural to us, which are our own training in much more traditional authoritarian and control-based spaces, which is really hard in teacher education to figure out how to create compassionate environments and communities of adults when we've never done that. Like we haven't built those communities in thoughtful ways inside of school settings before, even when we want them to emerge with the children. I'm doing some writing right now with the American Montessori Society for some summer professional development for them, and it's around self-care for teachers. I think even like all the language that you hear in social media and news now about self-care for teachers puts the responsibility on the individual teacher to take care of themselves. When maybe the question we should be asking is, how do we create communities where we're caring for each other, where the self-care that the care that we need, we receive because we've offered it to someone else first. And that we're building more interrelated communities. In Montessori classrooms, we call them societies by cohesion, where the children depend on each other. And so as a result, everybody's needs are always met. They're always working for the collective good. But as adults, we don't know how to create those communities as intrinsically as the children know how to do them before we've trained them how to be different kinds of people.
I see Gard has a question.
So again, just thank you so much. I have really reacted strongly to George Bush's No Child Left Behind. I feel as we're looking at autocracies across the planet, we've created our own educational autocracy, which has been oppressive to our children. I've been a professor at the university for 25 years. And when I get my students, they are like passive recipients. There's no humble curiosity. There's no imaginative play. There's no dialogue. And it takes me about a half semester to kind of open up that lock. So I'm curious as to whether or not Montessori has been invited into the national conversation on education, whether or not the Department of Education has been curious about Montessori, because I think No Child Left Behind has left millions and millions and millions of children behind.
No, I mean, I absolutely concur from a university perspective as well. I know one of the struggles that I have with incoming freshmen every year is that university life asks them to value things that their school experiences before they've gotten here did not value. I think it's more of a crisis now than it has been in previous generations, because this particular generation of college-going students, the typical development or the typical students of 18 to 24 have had 13 years of No Child Left Behind, a high accountability, standardized, quantified way of defining themselves, where their contributions as thinkers have been measured by particular numbers and very little gray space. It's also the first generation of growing adults that's existed post 9/11, where their parents are aware of, at least here in the US anyway, of the very real potential that the life outside of our houses is dangerous in ways that we weren't willing to acknowledge before. And it's the first generation of students that are college going who've come in a post-Columbine era, where for kids that are coming into college now, they have never not gone to school when school wasn't a place that they might get shot. And that triple load is a lot to bear on the minds and hearts of 18-year-olds. So I want to start the response by just acknowledging that this is very hard work, both for people, but for the students themselves, but also for university faculty who are trying to respond to them in different ways. Montessori is welcome as a policy, as a curriculum in 49 out of the 50 states. There are public Montessori schools in almost every state in the country right now, and about half of the children who are served in Montessori in the United States anyway are served in public settings. Inside of my university, I'm at the top 20 University of Education, and I sneak Montessori in the back door. So I have it in my office. I've integrated some of the practices into my classrooms because I'm for the first time experimenting with ungraded spaces, which is contrary to a lot of what's valued, particularly at a high academic university like mine. But my classes are not graded in a traditional letter grade model anymore. But similarly to my previous comment about where teachers find that comfort to do it, it's taken me 17 years on faculty to feel comfortable saying I am assessing students according to a value system that I don't actually believe and I think is hurting them. And so I'm gonna expend some of my own social capital as a person in this academy to change the way that I do it. I don't know what we do for young professors or novice professors to give them the same kind of support to say it is okay to teach in a way that you value, rather than to re-edify systems that none of us think are working very well.
Could I add to that? So yeah, I agree with that. I'm not at the university level. However, I have worked in public education. Believe I am an urban educator. That's what I believe in. I believe in working in public schools and under resource communities. And while there is definitely damage as a result of No Child Left Behind, what it did do was identify there were children who weren't getting educated. And so the response to that was not done the right way. And, you know, because anytime you start putting in accountability and then there's fear and they tie dollars to it and all those things. So yes, I agree with all that, but it did say there are children who are not being educated in this country. We must do something about that. And that's important. And so the beauty of you mentioned that we have all of these Montessori schools, particularly over 500 public Montessori schools. Some of them are accredited by American Montessori Society and other affiliations. The beauty of that is, particularly if you have a Montessori principal, is that you then get to reconcile that these are the things that the world, the government, whoever believes children should know. We get to decide how we impart that knowledge, how we create the educational spaces for those children to learn. And so I think there's the rub, right? Most people, it's particularly if you're not in a Montessori space, what most people aren't, you can't do that. But if there's a Montessori program, and I'm not downplaying any Montessori program, anybody who wants to do something differently to serve children, I'm all for it. But let's just make sure we're getting our bang for our buck. But if we are truly implementing Montessori as it says it should be done, is it space in there? Is there an advocate in that space, in particular, in that public space, public school space in particular, who knows how does it look like here? That was always the conversation when I was a principal. Okay, we have to do this. What does it look like here? And quite frankly, there are many, 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 many times that my teachers never knew what came down the pike. Because I just told the district, I'm not doing that. It's not Montessori, it doesn't serve children. And if anybody's gonna get the lump, it's gonna be me. Very few times that I have to say, guys, we just have to do this one. Now, I'm not saying I didn't have children do testing and things like that. They did much fewer tests than the other schools did because it just wasn't aligned to how we did things. But it turns out that in most cases, they performed better. And another thing that we did, which was our responsibility as the adults in the building, let those children know that these numbers don't define you. These are things that some people decided you need to know, and this is how we use it in our world. And really, this test is for the adults. Did we teach you? Did we provide you an opportunity to learn the things that you were supposed to learn? I understand that's not what it is in most cases, but in Montessori, there's an opportunity to have those conversations. But I think it has to be, I do think that if there's Montessori leadership who understands that, oh, you know what, actually, it's called this in Montessori, it's just called this somewhere else. It's over here, it's called differentiated instruction. Over here, it's called something else. And if you have an interpreter who can then talk to the right people, then it makes it easier. But in most cases, we've had children leave our building and go to the traditional school. And every year they tell us how all the Montessori learning outcomes, our children are more independent. They're more compassionate. They know what, they don't use the term cosmic task, but they know where their place is in the world. They know how they can serve others. And that's because of the environment they were in. They took the same tests, but their environment was created differently for them. So it's unfortunate that so many children don't get the Montessori experience. And in Montessori, you have an opportunity to do things differently and still kind of fit in whatever this bubble is that was created.
You know, it's, yes, Wendy, please.
Yep, hi. Fascinating conversation. Thank you all. What came to mind for me was many years ago, when I was a Montessori teacher, a little boy, a 4-year-old who'd come in, he'd come to the Montessori school, very purist Montessori school from another form of school, and how every day he came in and nobody interfered with him, but he just stood by the shelves And then the following day, he just looked at the teachers, and again, nobody interfered, and it took about a week. And then I remember him sidling up to a shelf, and behind him, he pulled one of the practical life exercises, waiting for a teacher to pounce on him, and started to realize that nobody was going to interfere with what he was doing. And then he was off, and it was that sense of all the teachers in the room going, it took that amount of time. And God, I was thinking about in the universities. I know years ago, I was listening to a university professor, and he, for the first half term, when all the students arrived, he didn't give them anything set out to do. He said, no, you tell me what you want me to do. I'm here as your mentor, completely through, because they didn't believe them. At first they were upset about it, but then they suddenly realized that they had an expert mentor and companion. So it's this unlearning, I think, that's so interesting. And there are a few things that came up to me. When I trained, we talked about the inner life of the teacher and the spiritual development of the teacher, but there was nothing of that in the training. So one, I'm now super interested to know what all of you are, how you're approaching the spiritual development of the teacher, and how, because I think there are huge opportunities to look at the inner life, but actually inner practices, not just the intellectual understanding of why I should be reflective, but we've moved on so far in terms of the resources that are there to support our inner lives. So I'd be very interested to know how you're now doing that within Montessori training. And then I also think there are huge opportunities, enormous opportunities for Montessori to play a key role in terms of sustainability and peace studies. So what we're really saying is children coming out of Montessori schools they have a quality, and this is why Montessori was so keen about peace, but she also spoke so beautifully about love. There were things she said that I think 100 years later are really now on the button. So I think there are possibilities now for Montessori to move into an arena that wasn't there before. And the only other thing I was going to say is this non-interventionist aspect. And that is a big problem at the moment, because we're coming out of schooling systems where everything is based on performance and accountability and intervention. And the hardest thing about being a Montessori teacher when you come in from a traditional background was not interfering. I mean, I remember that very specifically, that you did not interfere with children who were immersed in their work. And I was mind blown when I really was mind blown by what 3, 4, and 5-year-olds were doing, because no one had ever told me that young children, without teachers being in control of them, were capable of such things. It literally, as I say, it changed my career path. But yeah, so lots of very interesting things, but that's how we switch from an interventionist culture, how we get teachers who are coming out of that background. So I'm super interested now in how you've moved on from like 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think you've identified some of the things that are key to Montessori teacher education and to our practices, though. There's a sort of standard rule that wherever you are and wherever your Montessori teacher background is, that one of the rules that we follow is that we don't correct unintentional error. And I think that it seems like a smaller ask of teachers than it actually is. It's a huge ask, because if I am coming into a classroom of 3-year-olds or 6-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and I have to sit on my hands, if I see a child engaging in purposeful work, even if I don't know what the purpose is, it offers the child so much respect to say, I don't have to fix you. You're actually already full and intact and whole. And when Montessori talks about the secret of childhood or following the child, it's because she believed that children would become different adults than we have been, unless we kept interfering with them and told them who they were supposed to be before they had an opportunity to uncover it for themselves. And anytime that I step into a child's space and interrupt them from something that is meaningful or purposeful to them, I'm telling them, I already know what kind of adult you need to be. And so let me help you get better on track. But goodness, like if that was actually the case, we wouldn't we wouldn't be in the political strife that we're in. We wouldn't have the equity issues that we're in. We would be treating each other as adults with a totally different level of peacefulness and compassion than we do. Like I'm the very, very worst adult to model, right? Because I've already become I'm already the outcome of all of these other experiences. The child's promise is always going to be greater than mine is as an adult. And if I keep thinking of them as things to fix and correct, I'm just going to make more hostile, competitive, violent, uncompassionate adults.
I have a comment and a question that I'd like to hear your thoughts on, the three of your thoughts on. I think the comment has to do with language and it has to do with transformation. And I just sense from everything that you're saying that Montessori is one of those transformed but transforming organizations to goals that really direct themselves to the individual, the growth of the individual, the development of the individual, and take into account with great reflection a particular situation. A kid comes to you very unique in his experiences, both they be positive or negative. And I think that empathy requires that we cognitively try to, navigate the what's the situation all about with the effective empathy, which is resonating emotionally with that child. I just think this has been exciting for me because in the medical profession, we see the same thing. We see the same thing as, quote, mentors or teachers, and we still use the language of teacher. And in the past several years, working with compassion integrity training, I really embraced the language of facilitator. I'm a facilitator, not a teacher. I don't know all the answers. And together we can learn better how to go forward. So that's my comment. But my question is how, and there is a local Montessori school in Southern Dallas, which is where our greatest need is, Amira, with regard to diversity and leaving children behind. These children need the kind of support that you were talking about earlier. They are the kids that have been left behind. They are the kids that we need to address. So my question, in this particular organization or school, they reach out to the parents of unborn children who are being born, that of course the hope is that they will enter into this Montessori type of environment, but they reach out to these parents. So I'm just asking you from a national, international perspective, is Montessori, is that part of what Montessori is doing or will do in the future to reach out to parents of kids that aren't even born yet, and when they're born, be able to mentor them into the Montessori school system? So thank you.
So well, I know there's already infant toddler in Montessori, but I hear your question as, are Montessori organizations or institutions reaching out to communities before the children are even born to help that, that line? So they're already caring for them. And so I think about the Harlem Project, which is basically it was a grand project in a very under-resourced community in Harlem. And what happened was they decided that we have to go before the children are even born, start supporting families in order to actually change lives, change generational curses, break the cycle, right? And so I actually think that's a great idea. Sometimes when you already have the students, it's automatic, right? I can think about having one Montessori student from a family, and if that is a great experience for that family, if they feel like they belong in there, you're inclusive, if they feel like their humanity is kept intact as they are learning when you're doing stuff with them and not at them, because historically people think they're less than, that there is a better opportunity to link onto that family, and one after another, each one of those children will come into the school. If you have an instant Tyler program, it's easier, but when you're talking about public education, they typically don't come until they're 3, because that's when the funding starts. And so I do think there's a great degree of, that makes great sense. And that's why, you know, schools aren't vacuums. Schools are within communities. And so even if you don't have children in your building at that time, the outreach is always participate in community things. Where's the library? Go talk about your school there. Where's the local library? What's the football team? Make sure if you have kids who are in your school or on the football team or the soccer team or the baseball team, that you're a presence and you're holding conversations and building relationships. And when you're learning about families, you know, I always do it the flip way. Like, you talk to parents about what they want for their child, and what they want to be whole, they want to be cared for, they want them to have freedom and creative spaces and autonomy and all these wonderful things. And then you can say, oh, that sounds like Montessori. Let me tell you more. And so you build those relationships and you like pull them in, because I do believe Montessori can be life-changing for families, because it's a different way of doing and a different way of thinking. But I do want to also add that there are cases where, no, I don't think teachers come in and they should have to intervene, to your point, right? That's not what we're about. But it is a social justice issue if we know that Johnny can't read and we don't do things to help Johnny read and he's not 9. And so even in our Montessori context, we can think about what are the lessons that need to be available for this student to help move he or she forward. So keep engaging with the community.
Thank you. Thank you.
Going to say at the Montessori Group, a lot of effort is being made to do a lot of social impact work, to reach out to those communities who may not have even heard of Montessori, so that that's part of the conversation and is part of an option that's available to them. And I think it's really important that every one of us sort of starts to think more reflectively upon, you know, what we sort of see as the the purpose of education. You know, are we sort of always sort of thinking about education as a destination in terms of the grades that we want individuals to get, or do we think about, you know, education as a journey so that every individual, you know, develops into the best version of themselves? I think until we start making those distinctions, we'll have a bit of a battle, and you know, we just have to start that conversation. So, Wendy.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that and say the good news is, because I'm very embedded in global conversations on education systems, wider education systems, and the move towards ecosystemic thinking, personalization, you know, schools as living systems. I mean, all the narrative around where the global move in education is very much much more aligning with Montessori's belief system. So as I say, for me, I think there's never been a better opportunity to start looking at the narrative that's going on and bringing the two together. It's always a dilemma when you have people like Montessori and Waldorf, for you're stuck in the library according to, in fact, both had extraordinary, interesting things to say, and so we should be kind of celebrating the best of what we now understand about human nature, and also the idea that humanity is evolving, and what Montessori saw was we should just be holding this unknown quality, this child that we don't know, and that we want that child to become whoever they're going to become, and we can't predict what that is, and that kind of futures thinking, and not interfering with this new evolving human being who's nothing like anything in the past. I think there's some magic around that. Yeah.
I would add Reggio Emilia to that mix too, and I think that, you know, I am trained as a Montessori teacher. I'm a Montessorian in down to the cellular level, but I think it's like any other doctrine. It's just a different way of describing something that's bigger than my own opportunity to to understand. And so if people get to the same outcomes and call it something different along the way, that is just fine with me. We have a long history in the US of a lot of politicalization, even within the Montessori space, and a lot of the struggles that exist inside of Montessori equity issues right now, they mirror the same paths of inequity that have happened in other school settings. So we are not above the fray for that. And I think we have work to do internally to think about the ways in which we've propelled the Montessori movement as an organization in ways that have been on the necks of people who might have otherwise benefited from this worldview. But I just also draw attention to the work of Yolanda Seeley Ruiz. If you haven't heard of Yolanda's work before, Yolanda is at Columbia, and she's just one of my favorite readers and speakers, but she talks about teacher education from the perspective of love. She's both a poet and a teacher educator, an equity advocate, and just I like to bathe in her words. But it's another rabbit hole to go track down if you're interested in other people that are also thinking along the same lines that it sounds like you are, Wendy.
I think Montessori has an opportunity to, as things are changing and as we are acknowledging and recognizing, as Catherine just said, that these things happen in Montessori spaces as well. And for hardcore Montessorians in particular who say, this is what Montessori is, it's really up to those, we're not governing bodies, but, so AMS, AMI, it's up to us to say, this is what we believe. AMI now has a statement, and AMS has an anti-bias, anti-racism statement, a non-discriminatory statement. So just like if we were in a school and in a classroom and we have the standards and criteria, I can go to the district and say, hey, this is what we say we are. We're an accredited Montessori school. These are the things that we have to do. Now, when we have Montessori schools that are struggling with how do we move forward in this anti-bias, anti-racist work, in this equity work, in this diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we're looking to the AMIs and the AMSs and the MEPIs and all the other organizations to see where is their journey taking them, what kind of professional development are they providing, what kind of trainings are they providing, so that we all have an understanding that the world is changing. We have to heal some things. We have to support the educators. Now, it has to be done. Nobody says that they know how to do it, but there are folks who do. So where is the support? Everybody wants it to be equitable, right? Everybody wants to elevate children and keep their humanity, but some people just don't know how to do it. And so where are the resources to provide it? So that's also the responsibility of those organizations to say, hey, here's a path. So for AMS in particular, I'm not going to say that we have it all together, but we're on a path, and we can say, this is our transformational journey so that we can always be in service of children in the right way. And we cannot be in service of children in the right way if we're not in service of the adults who are in service of children in the right way. And so we are constantly looking at what are the things that we need to do to kind of dismantle and disrupt the inequities that are preventing every child who wants a Montessori education to have that full experience so that they can reach their full potential, because we believe it's a liberatory experience. When it's done the way it's supposed to be done, in spaces the way it's supposed, with the right people, because there are people who do Montessori because they like Montessori. They don't care about the kids in the class. They just going down the list. But there is such an opportunity to change the literal world. And the children who are coming, they're going to be the change agents who is like, we won't have to have, I'm sorry to say, we might not have to have this committee because everybody's living the right way. We're already compassionate. We're already living by the golden rule. And that's really what the journey is. And so I just think we have to also have those exemplars and showing that intentionality around this is what we think it should look like. And this is how we're going to help you get there.
I think we're coming up and we have two individuals who have questions, so maybe we could address those questions. And then I want to leave a little bit of time for Marilyn to let us know what's coming up next at the forum. So I think, Cindy, you had your hand up first.
Hi, yes, so I will keep it short and sweet. I'm very grateful that Ole told me about this call today about Montessori. Montessori is something that I'm sort of involved in on a side initiative. I got involved with an organization called Peace Literacy Institute out of the United States. And Paul Chappelle started it. He's a former Iraqi captain and war veteran and young. He's only in his 40s, but he drew me in with his message, peace literacy. And it turns out that the Montessori program, there's a school in Ohio, the Montessori, one of the schools in Ohio is working with peace literacy and has adopted their curriculum. And I'm part of raising money to help make this curriculum more accessible and to help afford teacher training. I'm a Canadian, by the way. So Amura, I'm just outside of Detroit, where I'm in Windsor, Ontario. So we're kind of close, you know, Michigan, Ontario. But my passion is peace and ironically education. I'm a high school dropout, so is my husband, but we're both successful entrepreneurs. And my next chapter in life is peace literacy. This is we're retiring out of the business and my focus is peace literacy, and I'm just following my heart and it's leading me. And so I wanted to put a plug in for peaceliteracyinstitute.org if you feel called to check it out. The curriculum is free and we're working really hard to make it more accessible and have the teacher training be affordable or free. And anyway, so just, check out peaceliteracyinstitute.org. And I'm so glad that there is a Montessori school that is adopting it. And they were just featured last year in the Montessori public newspaper that I guess that gets circulated among the Montessori schools in the US. And it was titled Behavior Support Informed by Peace Literacy. And that article is free and it is on the website, peaceliteracy.org. So thank you so much for what Montessori and the teachers are doing, and Dr. Amari and Petri. I'm just thrilled to be a small part of where Montessori is going and the partnership with Peace Literacy. So thank you very much for all that you do for the children and our future.
Thank you, Cindy. Maybe you could put your website link in the chat. That would maybe be helpful.
Sure.
We have a question from Cece.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, guys. I just want to say that it's really inspired to hear you all talk about this. And I love the way you say your vision of that this is a service for children. It really changes the game to see the things in that way. I just want to ask if you could please elaborate a little bit more on how do you get the parents involved? Do you have a specific training? Do you have committees or anything like that? Thank you.
I think, Cecilia, in the UK, it's very different. We're not, Montessori is not in the public system. It's very much in the private system. So parents often come to Montessori having some idea of what Montessori education is about. So getting them involved sometimes is a lot easier than it might be in the public school system. Some schools will have committees where parents are more involved. Others will operate in different systems. So there's no set way of engaging with the parents. But we very much believe, especially in the early years, it's really important to have that partnership with parents as much as you can and engage them and involve them in the whole sort of support of the child. Because, if we are in service to the child, then that there has to be consistency in that approach. So it's not just about what happens when the child is in a particular setting or school, but what also happens after that and how the child is really supported through life at home as well. So a lot of conversation will happen with the parents and the educators.
And I love the practical recommendations. I've just placed into the chat a link to a school here in Nashville that's called Nia House. I love amplifying the work at Nia House because I think that their model for parent education is particularly strong. They are a private school, but if parents come through, they are a sliding scale tuition school with generous support for students whose parents can't afford the tuition, but also to the point of working with families, not just to make sure that the tuition is accessible to them, but that it's accessible without sacrifice to the rest of their quality of life too. So they work with families both from a financial perspective to do financial literacy for families, to be able to help with vocational support for families, but they look at the family really holistically to say that children don't exist in a vacuum. They live within organizations of families around them. And I love Nia House's model for how they do both parent education about Montessori, but also parent education about healthy family structures, about financial consistency, and about the kind of vocational supports that they may need to be able to take advantage of a particular school model in a way that is actually a blessing to the whole family. They're just a really, really strong school, and they admit families at different stages. So if they have space in the school, they'll admit the family as part of regular school community. But if the family is placed on the wait list, they still start providing parent education before the family is even enrolled in the program. With that sense that it's in service not just to the children in the classroom, but for the whole community.
It's wonderful, Catherine. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you, Emra, and thank you, Preeti. Most excellent presentation. I would need to leave a few minutes from Marilyn to maybe make a comment or two, and also give us the way forward as far as the EdNet forum. But I can't express the amount of appreciation I really feel, not just in my head, but also in my heart, about what you all are doing in the world. And it's so, so important. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Marilyn, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Your mic is off, Marilyn.
Thank you so much for telling me that. I just put something in the chat box. It's a program that's been around for a number of years, but keeps getting better, I think, as it evolves. It's by Don Dinkmeyer originally, and now it's been taken over by another group of people, including his son. But it's the STEP program, Systematic Training for Effective Parenting. And I was involved in the initial conversations and pulling groups together in circle from schools and just presenting that program. And I think it's a real compliment to Montessori and to the work of Alfred Adler. So if you get a chance to look at it, it is just kind of a wonderful thing. And thank you so much for coming today. And Catherine, having been in the world of training new teachers with a program called Urban Education Program in Chicago, as part of the consortium of the Associated Colleges, I really understand what you're talking about. And I'd love to continue to talk with you just about sharing some of the things that you're doing, some of the things that we did in that program. I realize as these things come along, how much I really love some of the things that we've been talking about. And so Charlie said, we're coming up with certainly a number of other programs. And here you are on May 5th, but on May 16th, and I do believe that that is not a Thursday, so people will have to have their heads up in order to make an adjustment, because Dr. Andrew Garner will be with us and he cannot come on a Thursday. And in talking with him, we found that there's really going to be a need to have two presentations, one on childhood, psychology of childhood, and then we talked about trauma today. He will be back on June 6th, talking about the stress in the lives of children, and obviously in the lives of caretakers and caregivers. On June 2nd, we are back on a Thursday. So we have some things that are kind of coming together here, but the Respect program is from the Netherlands, and it is a program that happens and schools kind of come into the program, there'll be an opportunity to kind of follow some of the activities and processes that are used in the program. And it has also been pulled up in a way that is unusual. A business from the Netherlands has decided to sponsor this program and introduce it into countries in which their businesses occur. So I think that would be an interesting exchange.
Marilyn, I need to jump to another meeting. I've just made you host, so
Okay, thank you.
the
This will
recording
just
will
be-
end now. Thank you
Okay.
all.
Just real quickly,